All right. We are starting. My name is Austin Roos. I'm president of CFAM. We put on these monthly webinars to bring our supporters and our opponents up to date on what's going on at the United Nations and various UN issues. And one of the webinars that I wanted to do for a very long time is with some of the war horses, if they will pardon the expression, of the UN pro-life movement, the founders of the UN pro-life movement, to talk about the early days of the UN pro-life movement, negotiations back in those days, and also moving forward. I mean, these guys have been involved, were involved from the very beginning. And Peter, who just informed me that he's monitoring the CSW negotiations as we speak. So we're expecting 3 guests today. We have 2 right now, and we're expecting a third. I'm delighted to welcome John Klink, who was the longtime chief negotiator on social issues with the Holy See Mission at the United Nations. John, we'll talk more about this as the morning progresses. But John, there hasn't been anybody like John at the Holy See Mission since John left. He was a wonder to watch during negotiations. And we'll talk about this too. Back in those days, NGOs were actually able to get into negotiations, and sit in the gallery and watch John Klink work the room. A real hero in the UN pro-life cause. We also have Peter Smith, an Australian who's lived the last many years in Scotland, and who was a representative at the UN of International Right to Life, and also the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child. Peter was a stalwart of the UN pro-life movement from the very beginning up until, well, it's still, although he hasn't been actually at the UN, I think, in a couple of years, but who has? What's that?
2 years ago, I was there at the NGO committee.
Right before COVID.
Just before lockdown.
Yeah. So we're waiting for Jeanne Head, who was
nothing new there.
And it's going to be great to kid her about arriving late.
Out of character.
Jeanne Head she is the grand dame of UN pro-life lobbyists. And we'll talk more about this, but I remember late at night during negotiations, I was never one to want to stay until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I would sneak out, and I would have to sneak out because Jeanne Head would punish me if she caught me, which she did the next day, but at least not that night. So everyone related to CFAM, welcome John Klink and Peter Smith, and hopefully in a minute, Jeanne Head. So John, why don't we begin this way? Why don't we begin one of the interesting stories, the origin story. The origin story of the UN pro-life movement. John, why don't, since you were connected to the Holy See and it had an awful lot to do with the Holy See, why don't you talk about the origin story of the UN pro-life movement?
Well, I think that the major focus of all of our inspiration was Pope John Paul II. No question about it. And if you look at the history of that period and all of the presidents who came and went of the United States, as well as the various political blocs that came and went, I began in 1987. And the reason it was an interesting period because it was just prior to the first major world conference, which is the World Summit on Children in 1990. And that was sort of the watershed moment for the radical left trying to take over the United Nations. And so John Paul became very active. Just prior to that, there was the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and some of the language that he used in his letter to that gathering was that the Holy See, he says, the Holy See gladly acceded to and endorses the convention on the understanding that goals, programs, and actions stemming from it will respect the moral and religious convictions of those to whom they are directed. In particular, the moral convictions of parents regarding the transmission of life, with no urging to resort to means which are morally unacceptable, as well as their freedom in relationship to the religious life and education of their children. And that he can be seen as really being the prophet of his time, in order warning people of what really was just about to happen, and that all of these groups were going to come together and try to change the UN and use it as a top-down influencer, and to try to change the direction of democratic processes and constitutions. And so everything went fairly well during the World Summit for Children. And then the World Summit for Children was the largest gathering of heads of state or heads of government. And it began there were 71. And so the UN thought, this is a great idea. Let's continue these conferences on various different subjects. And so the next one was the one in Rio de Janeiro on the environment. And that was when, but we were still under the first Bush administration. And so we had, there was a cover that we could depend on, that the United States would help to make sure that things didn't get too radicalized. And then the next thing on the agenda was the 1994 population conference in Cairo. And the Pope, very fortunately for the world, happened to read this document. I don't know who put it in his hands, but if you read his letter to Nafis Sadiq, which is dated the 18th of March of 1994, it tells all of the story, and you can, it's for me, it's the best summary document of all of the dangers and what is to be avoided and how it should be avoided and what we should be focusing on, rather than what the UN is focusing on. And so
And
at that time,
I don't believe that I have ever read that letter.
it's on the internet, and I'll be happy to send you the link to it. But it's just the best synthesis of everything, because what happened was that Nafis Sadiq thought that she was going to Rome to be applauded by the Holy Father, and he read her the Riot Act, and in very great detail, and he had obviously read every word. And subsequent to that, he wrote a letter unprecedented to every head of state in the entire world, including President Clinton. And then he also appealed to all of the religious leaders of the world to send like-minded people to the United Nations and to start the whole pro-life. I mean, that for me was the most the clarion call, as it were, of pro-life people to the United Nations. And so at that point, then that's when you and I met, and that's when Peter came on board, and Jeanne, who was the absolute implacable leader of all of those, every single, if it was raining, if it was snowing, if it was whatever, she was there until the bitter end. And we had negotiations, as was Peter, and we had negotiations that would go on, as you said, Austin, until 5 o'clock in the morning. I mean, literally 5 or 6.
John, how did you get involved? You got involved through then Archbishop, now Cardinal Martino.
Yes, I always liken it to being invited to help out at the parish barbecue. And so he said, wouldn't you like to come and help me at the United Nations? And we were at our wedding, actually, in Montecito in Santa Barbara, California, and in the parking lot. I'll never forget. And it was sort of like a cha-ching moment. And he said, wouldn't you like to come and help? And I said, sort of naively, sure, that would be wonderful. And how much time would it take? And he said, oh, a couple of weeks. So a couple of weeks.
How about a couple of
into,
decades?
Yeah, turned into 14 years as a Holy See delegate. And then because of Jeanne Head's lobbying, I became a delegate for the United States and changed hats. And at one point, Ireland, because I'm also an Irish citizen, so the Irish came up to me and they said, are you thinking of, also helping Ireland? And but by that point, their politics had changed, so it wasn't even.
It's funny because I just read an article by Nick Burns, and we can maybe get into Nick Burns in a little bit later, but he was your nemesis. We'll talk about that later, but it was ironic that yesterday I just read an article by Nick Burns. So Peter, when did you first hear about this thing that was going on I guess in Cairo or what?
Well, I went along to a SPUC national conference in 1994, and John Smeaton and Majid Khatmi and a couple of others had just got back from Cairo. And I thought, wow, this sounds exciting, because back in Australia I'm just trying to think when it was, when the Convention on the Rights of the Child was being ratified by Australia, I didn't like some of it. And I thought, it's too late now to do much about it. You can ask the government not to ratify it, but they will anyway. I thought you really need to be there when it's being negotiated. So I had this at the back of my mind. And when I went along to this SPUC National Conference, I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. And I volunteered to work for SPUC, and eventually they started to pay me. But I got sent twice to the UN. The first one was the Copenhagen PrepCom in New York in January 95, and then the Beijing PrepCom in New York in 95. And I was in abject terror the first few times. Arrested the second day for having a fetal model set out. Bella Abzug dobbed me into security. And then Jeanne Head made the head of security.
Hold on one second. You're skipping rapidly over your near arrest by UN security, which
wasn't a near arrest. It was an arrest.
The viewers should understand that Peter went to the UN and he put out those display of fetal models. Yeah. And Bella Abzug, who was a New York City radical feminist politician who ensconced herself at the United Nations for many years. The feminists took their fight to the United Nations because they wanted to use the United Nations to impose their view on the world. And their main battle wagon was Bella Abzug. And so Bella Abzug did not like your fetal models. Is that right?
No, you see, John Smeaton had this fetal model set out in Cairo, and all the Africans and everyone else flocked around him to look at it. And it was like a magnet for them. So John Smeaton says, just you take that fetal model set over there, Peter, and you just, display it out in the hallway, and they'll all come flocking around you. And well, they did for about 2 minutes, but then Bella Abzug limps past and says, you won't be safe there for very long, Sonny, she says. And sure enough, a few minutes later, these two plainclothes security chaps came down to arrest me and browbeat me and escort me off the property.
They booted you out of the UN?
Yep, and if I ever came back with a fetal model set, that'd be it. I'd be banned for life. It's one of the few times Bella actually talked to me. Did she talk to you much, John?
Bella?
Yeah.
Oh, Bella and I had an ongoing rapport, and what would happen is at the conferences in those days, they would distribute the documents, literally the paper documents at the back of the room. And so we would go back to pick up the documents. And at one point she brushed into me and I was on the phone and she said, he's talking to the Pope. He's talking to the Pope. And I said, no, Bill, that's only on the white phone. And
over the years, Peter Smith became quite adept at courting UN security. Peter, I think you probably learned that lesson there, is that you or over time, talk about your relationship with UN security and what you would do.
Well, just prior to that, Austin, I worked in the Roads and Transport Department in Tasmania for 3 years and had 24 transport police work for me and a couple of prosecuting officers. So I've worked in law enforcement. And I know that, if the coppers pull you over for something, there's got to be some breach of some regulation. So when these two plainclothes jerks pulled me, and I says, what have I done wrong? Show me the regulation I have breached. And they couldn't. So I knew they were on a slippery wicket. So the next day I told Jeanne Head, and she was furious, and I mean furious. And I can remember meeting with Chief McCann and the secretary of the Copenhagen meeting, and Chief McCann apologised for how I'd been treated and all the nonsense. And after that, me and Chief McCann were very friendly. And I remember at one point at one of the CSWs there, it was when Bush was president and Bush 2, and the feminists weren't getting their way. So they had a little demonstration outside conference room 1. And as soon as I saw it, I rushed up to Chief McCann's office and I met him on the way down. I says, Chief McCann, these NGOs are out of control down here. You've got to do something. And he rushed down and cleaned them all up. And he used to actually come to me sometimes of a night and say, Peter, how's things down here? I said, all the radical feminists have gone home. No need to worry. And he'd just go home. It was brilliant. I had a great rapport with him. And I always made a friend in security of someone. And one of them was an Aussie. He had heard my accent. This was many years later. And Jeanne Head one time had searched her bag and they found some extra passes that she had meant to hand in, and she'd forgot to do it. And it's illegal to have more than your own pass, you see. So they confiscated it from her. And so this Aussie security chap, we were telling him about it, and he went up to check what had gone on, and he got the passes back for her. And as he was leaving, he says, I'm just going back to give my staff some trauma counselling from the incident. You can imagine how Jeanne went through them. So it was always good to have a friend in security.
Yeah. So John, talk a little bit about, the Holy See back in your day was a lot more assertive in negotiations than in recent years. And I want to talk about why that is. But you had a pretty strong warrant from Rome to work that room. Is that correct?
Well, this traces back again to the World Summit for Children, and I was reading through the World Summit document, and at the time, the head of UNICEF was a wonderful man named Jim Grant, who was a former U.S. diplomat, and he was a highly Christian gentleman, and he loved the Catholic Church because of all the work that it had done throughout the world. And he said that UNICEF could only have done a third of the work that it was able to do without the Catholic Church helping. So he was always very supportive. And I went to his deputy and I said, I don't know what my rights are here in terms of, can I influence in any way this document? And he said, absolutely. He said, while you're an observer state for the Holy See, he said, this is a world conference and you have equal footing with everyone. And since you're working for the Vatican, you have the moral authority. And so I hightailed it over to the phone booth and called Archbishop Martino. And I said, Archbishop, I'm told that I can make changes in this. Is that permissible? Do you think that that's okay? And he said, permissible? It's absolutely wonderful.
Well, let me ask you a quick question. Did the Holy See not know until that moment that you could be active negotiators in these conferences?
The assumption at that point was that, you know, we were observers. And in fact, one of Bishop McHugh, who was one of the members of the delegation, at one point cautioned me, and he said, John, he said, we should just be prophetic. And so I called Archbishop Martino and I said, Monsignor McHugh at the time, I said, he's telling me we should be prophetic. And he said, yes, you know, you should be prophetic. He said, you should go forward. And I said, well, and I only learned to appreciate this once I was working for the United States, and every single comma, every single T that had to be crossed or I that had to be dotted had to be approved both by the State Department and the National Security Council. I mean, every single thing. And so I said, so Excellency, what are my instructions? And he said, follow the gospel.
I describe Cardinal Martino as the kind of guy that you want in a bar fight, because he would be the one that would break the bottle and hold it to the other guy's neck. You know, he is one of the great heroes of one of the unsung heroes of the international pro-life movement. You know, the story that I tell is when Nafis Sadiq complained to him about me. And he said, "Madam, I barely know the man," and she says, "But Archbishop, he has Catholic in the name of his organization," and he said, "So does Catholics for a Free Choice, madam. You cannot have it both ways."
And he enjoyed that little exchange, I can tell you, because he told me several times exactly the same thing.
Is that right? Yeah. We. Go ahead, John.
He wouldn't have taken the bottle himself. He would hand you the bottle and then support you.
Oh, go ahead, Peter. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to say something.
No, you're right.
So, John, your time negotiating started at the World Conference on Children, which, by the way, it's very interesting. That whole process resonates to this very moment in all of the debates going on in the school boards in the United States, because they're all about the rights of parents to guide and direct the education of their children, which is right out of what eventually became the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which also separated children from their parents as individual rights-bearing creatures, which is one of the dangers and one of the things that the school boards want, is to separate children from their parents.
So the convention I wasn't involved in the negotiation for the convention. That had already been done. And so it was the brainchild of Jim Grant to have all of the heads of state come to promote the convention and the rights of the child, full stop. And so that was the first stage at which I became involved. And the reason I was involved was because the 2-week stint that the Archbishop had programmed for me was to be the Holy See's representative on the UNICEF executive board. And so that I continued for 8 years as the Holy See's representative. And through that, then I became the negotiator for the World Summit for Children. And then it just became this rolling thing. Every time you would stop on a Friday negotiating for one conference and start on the Monday for the next conference. You know, it was just nonstop.
Well, that's very much, you know, the lives of my team here, you know, Lisa and Stefano primarily. I mean, right now we're in what I call commission season, you know, that starts, you know, early in the year and goes through the spring. And now they have this, you know, the high level political summit, which goes in the summertime and then into the General Assembly. I mean, one of the funny things about negotiations these days is that we're negotiating the exact same things that you guys negotiated 25 years ago. It's sad and pathetic and a little bit boring because it's, reproductive health, reproductive rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's the same thing. And one of the things that they have never achieved, and this is thanks to all of us, is that they've never achieved an international right to abortion in a UN document. Talk about that.
Well, that was clearly what, if you look at the pattern of who the presidencies of the United States, you can see exactly what you could foretell what was coming, right? And so as soon as Clinton hit the tracks and Hillary, the two of them just pushed and pushed and pushed for an international right to abortion. And one of the great things that happened was that for the World Conference, for the Cairo Population Conference, which is where they really hope to make that stick and make it happen, the Holy Father named his spokesperson, Joaquin Navarro-Valls, to be on the delegation. And that really changed just about everything because, because it was a wonderful shortcut to the Holy Father. And I mean, even those in the Vatican, every day when we were there, the Holy Father we would get a telephone call saying the Holy Father was just in this audience, and he got out of the car and he said, "How are things going in Cairo?" And then we'd have a call 3 hours later saying the Holy Father just went into this meeting, and before the meeting he said, "How are things going in Cairo?" And and Joaquin was able to then call the Holy Father and tell him exactly what was happening at every moment. And it also, previously we had been trying to get our story out, and it was incredibly difficult because the New York Times, when they wanted to find out something, I would call the New York Times and I would say, "Would you like to hear our side of the story?" And they'd say, "Not really."
Let me digress for 1 second and tell a story about Joaquin Navarro-Valls. He was a numerary in Opus Dei, which means that he lived in community. He was an apostolic celibate, lived in community. And one of the things that Opus Dei people do, they have these things called the norms of piety, including doing spiritual reading and gospel reading every single day. And a friend of mine was at Cairo, and he was walking down a hallway, and Cairo was madness, high pressure everywhere. And sitting outside of a negotiating room was Joaquin Navarro-Valls quietly reading from his daily spiritual reading. He was even in the midst of all that madness, he was keeping up with the norms of piety that he had committed himself to do.
He was a wonderful man. And that reminds me of one of the most interesting stories of the Cairo Conference is that he had a major confrontation through the press with Al Gore, the vice president. And he had caught him on a statement that he had made saying that the United States was not actually, is that Jeanne?
I think we see Jeanne Head. Is that Jeanne? Jeanne, unmute. It looks like you're muted. Yeah, we can't hear you. There's a mute button down there somewhere, Jeanne. You need to find it and hit mute. Stefano, I know you're here. Can you call Jeanne and talk her through the mute button? John, continue your anecdote.
Anyway, so we are at the Cairo Conference, and we get a phone call from the ambassador of the United States asking for us to a meeting with the vice president. And we were saying, well, we're really busy. We're in the middle of this negotiation. And they said, it's the vice president of the United States. And so the Archbishop said, okay, we'll go. And so I'll never forget, we were given guards, and the Egyptian guards were late that morning. And so so the Archbishop says, well, you know, what do I do without the guards? I said, well, you can't keep the Vice President waiting. I'll wait here for the guards. And so 5 people went off in that car. And so they went off to meet the Vice President. And then I joined them in going through, literally, the car would go through chickens and trying to get through the route. We finally get to the Vice President. And so he said, well, the reason I've called you here today is because I wanted to find out if the Vatican, if we all negotiate in good faith, if the Vatican will actually sign off on the document. And so the Archbishop turned to me and he said, John, obviously we will, right? I mean, you know, he was looking for the wording for it. And I said, well, obviously we just signed off on the 2 world conferences prior to this. And so, yes, I mean, there's no question about the fact if we all negotiate in good faith and do the proper negotiation, we will. And so that afternoon, and as we walked in, he said, I just can't fail to notice that Dr. Novato Valls is not here. You know, we've had a few words over in our time. And so we said, yes, he's busy, telling the truth out there. And so at the end of the meeting, we went back, and that afternoon after lunch, Joaquin came up to me and he said, John, did you see what your friend Al Gore did? And I said, please, let's not call him my friend. And so I said, what did he do? And he said, read this. And he said, it was a press release that said, after his meeting with President Mubarak, the Vice President of the United States issued this press release indicating that, and in the press release it said, following our meeting, which I attended after being invited by the Holy See, I am more convinced than ever that they will never sign off on this document. So he lied about the fact that who was the invitor, and then he lied about the results of the meeting. And that was, for me, that was the end. I mean, I never trusted the man again. So anyway.
Peter, talk a little bit about the NGO coalition at the UN, starting in the early days, and how we came together, and talk about the nightly meetings. And wasn't it so different back in those days when we were all in the building and we would have nightly meetings and morning meetings and put out newspapers and things like that? It's vastly different from today.
Yeah, there was a chap called Peter Elliott, who was in Cairo, and he got John Smeaton to have a nightly meeting of the NGOs. And when he sent me over, he said to me, you chair the meetings. So that's what I did. And Jeanne Head asked me, did John Smeaton ask you to chair these meetings? I said, yeah. And then she just let it go. So that's how it worked out for several years. But Monsignor Peter Elliott used to be our liaison. He would come along and we'd sort of share what we were going to do, what sort of flyers we'd do and that sort of stuff. And he would check with the other negotiators in the Holy See. And if that was the way to go, that's the way we did it. We didn't do our own thing.
Talk about the daily flyers.
Yeah, we'd have an A4 flyer on
the NGO effort.
Yeah, we'd have a little, I don't know what you call it in America, the size of your paper, but we call it an A4 basically. We would pick one particular subject and we'd suggest some wording and why we wanted that wording, and we'd try to give it out to as many delegates as we could. And I can remember Jeanne Head thrusting a handful of these leaflets into my hand and say, give these out to the delegates. And I'd go around, and half the people I gave them to were NGOs. It took a while to work out what the badge was first. And the only ones you could get any time with were the NGOs from Africa or somewhere. And they didn't have a clue what was going on. I didn't have a clue what was going on. So we gave out these leaflets all over the place. And there was a technical point that everyone gave out leaflets, but you really weren't meant to give out leaflets.
Well, it's more than you weren't meant to. It was against the rules to leaflet.
Well, the rules were observed more in the breach than the observance. And actually, the Secretariat staff used to give out leaflets when they were lobbying for a pay rise. So even the Secretariat used to do it. And the other side used to do it, so we did it. And they really didn't like you giving it out inside the conference room. So we would give it out as the delegates came in or out of the conference room.
Yeah.
It became, for many years, an accepted fact that we gave out, there's flyers everywhere. This was before all the electronic stuff and everything. But there was flyers all over the place. And then latterly, they really clamped down on it. And we didn't do it after that, but years and years we did flyers.
Well, do you remember, I mean, we used to actually be in the room when negotiations were going on.
Yeah.
And you could actually leave the gallery and walk down and whisper in somebody's ear.
No, yeah, that was quite dangerous.
It was, but we did it nonetheless.
You couldn't get away with it that often.
Yeah.
I mean, I tried a couple of times and they flung me out. But
Yeah.
you would observe who was doing what and who were the players. Like Benin used to be a good one, and Senegal and different other people. And you'd watch to see who was in which desk, and you'd catch them as they came out the door or when they went back in at, say, 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
But to be down on the floor interacting with the delegates while the meeting was on was risky.
Yeah.
But as delegates, I remember that we were able, and I remember you, Austin, you would ask me at a certain point when to get involved on, there was some negotiation going on. And one of the things that was so fascinating is that at times the governments themselves did not know what their representatives were representing. Do you remember?
Right.
Oh yeah.
And
I mean, how could you brief your ambassador or diplomat on any of that sort of stuff? It was crazy, absolutely crazy what was going on. And I mean, you would be looking to find out who was a brave person who was possibly even willing to lose their job. That's what it basically amounted to. And I mean, I remember one in Istanbul at the Habitat Summit. There was a chap there from Romania that we found. Mary Meany, who's a very attractive American lass who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford doing a PhD. And I'm just trying to think of the chap's name, but he says, I'd met him and said hello, and Romania's normally, they never help. He says, introduce me. So I introduced him to Mary and he's chatting her up. You know, he was and I just thought, he's just an old pervert, you know, chatting at an attractive young lady. And then we got to reproductive health. And Romania, and you know, you got the usual stuff. It's the G77 didn't want the US did, and the Holy See didn't. And then Romania puts up his flag, and he gave it to him just exactly the way Mary told him. This is a housing summit. It's not a health summit. We don't need this wording anywhere in this document. And apparently, the US was so shocked, and they really didn't know anyone in Romania, because Romania never spoke up. It took 3 days to silence Pavel. It was just wonderful. But that's what
to silence him
before the meeting started, and you would see who would. It's like fishing. You'd throw the bait out and see who nibbled. You see, and because different ones from different countries would speak up, and you know, it's never the same country usually.
Yeah,
but we would have, for instance, agreements ahead of time with particular governments. We'd ask them if they would support us, and then based on what their response was, we knew that we could count on them. And so in this one case, as I recall, it was Bolivia who said that they would support the Holy See. And then suddenly you had this redhead woman who had, it was, you know, it wasn't even her own color, but anyway, I just remember the redhead. And she started just contradicting everything that we were trying to do, and just reading us, you know, the riot act. And so finally, and I thought, and I came back and I said, I thought that Bolivia had agreed to be, you know, the president had agreed that we were on the same side. And so I think it was at that point that I went to you, Austin, or one of you, and said, you know, we really need for the government back home to know what's happening. And so apart from us being able to do the diplomatic channels, if the government, you know, heard from the press that their representative was doing something untoward, then that would be very helpful. So it was a whole series of intercommunications that really could work very, very effectively on an international.
You know, I just want to, Jeanne, if you can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up? I see the top of your head, Jeanne. Can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? So maybe Jeanne can't even hear me. Jeanne, we can see the top of your head. Yep, there's a couch. Oh, there's a computer. Sorry, Jeanne, we can't hear you.
There may be a problem, Austin. I clicked on Jeanne's link because I didn't know any other way of getting in. So that might have caused a problem.
Oh, no, you had your own link.
I couldn't find it.
Ooh. Maybe that's the
Want me to
problem, but I
click
don't know
off
how to
and-
solve it.
Hi, Austin. This is Stefano. I'm trying to resolve the issue with Jeanne. We couldn't get it on the computer. We're trying to get it on the phone now. Yes, Peter took Jeanne's link.
Yeah,
and
I took Jeanne's
now
link.
Jeanne
wait.
took Peter's link.
Jeanne's
So-
thing just went green. Jeanne, speak.
She
Can you
can't
hear me?
hear. For some reason, she can't hear the Zoom webinar.
Will I click off and try and get back on again?
No, that's not going to help at this point.
Yeah, let's not do that. We
Okay.
will proceed and hopefully she will get back on. So John, when was the last time that you were involved with the Holy See mission at the UN?
It was, I'm trying to remember which conference it would have been. It was probably Beijing +5. And because after that, the White House asked me, because of Jeanne, to
Yeah.
join them. And so then it was a wonderful experience, because you can imagine even within our delegation to try to get the same sort of common mind put forward, but we managed. And I remember at one point we were negotiating actually on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There was some meeting, and the United States could not sign off on this document, and primarily because it's an oddity, but because you have death penalty for children in the United States, in some states for children under 18. And that's the reason that it's an impossibility, because they just can't, and the United States can't say that they're going to, because it's a states' rights thing. And so we were at the German embassy, and the ambassador kept trying to force us. And the fellow who was leading the delegation turned to me and he said, "John," he said, "I don't think this is going anywhere, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Let's go." And so we just left. And we went back to the embassy, to the United States mission, and Germany was calling and saying, you walked out of this meeting, et cetera. So I think that was, after that, I kept working with the United States, and what we would try to do is, when we weren't able to make appropriate changes in the document, even though we very much tried, if you look back and see the reservations that were made by the United States, they're very similar to those that were made by the Holy See.
But and I don't want to get into a sticky wicket here, but the Holy See was never really the same after you left. And maybe it was the combination of you and Martino and Navarro Valls, or you, Martino, but the Holy See was never as assertive as it was. Now, this was also at the same time that there was this drumbeat to have the Holy See kicked out of the UN. So when Martino left and Migliore came in, There was, Peter, would you say that there was a little bit of a backing off with regard to an assertive negotiation?
No, it wasn't too bad. I mean, Father Benet was good.
Oh, yes, he was. Yep, yep.
And I'm thinking, who was the one before that?
Who was the South African?
Oh, no, that's a different one. No, he's an American chap with a big thick neck.
Reinhardt.
Yeah, Reinhardt. He would fight pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, we were there.
Remember once he called a meeting together of all the NGOs, and I was there, and there were opposition NGOs in there. I said, Monsignor, we've got to close this meeting. This is not the meeting. Of course, all the opposition were in there, so we just closed it and had our meeting. Of course, we did it secretly. We didn't. I don't think we got infiltrated actually with our night meetings.
Yeah.
I remember Bishop Duane was fabulous too.
Oh, you know,
Who?
one of the best negotiating experiences that I ever
There was a
had
Canadian woman too. What was her? No, was it a Canadian woman? No, there have been some really good ones. The thing is, they weren't as good as working the room as what John Klink was.
Yeah.
John Klink would work the room. The
Yeah.
others a little bit, but not as much as what he did.
I was just about to say that the best negotiating experience that I ever had was in The Hague at one of these UNFPA meetings, and now Bishop Duane would sit on the side and give us marching orders in this little conference room, and he would say something to me, and we would spread out and we would whisper to all the negotiators, and they would do exactly what Duane said. I mean, it was maybe the best that I had ever seen.
That was exceptional.
UNFPA has never invited pro-life NGOs back to any of their conferences, but you know, things have changed so substantially since those days. You know, I remember back in the day, and this was maybe the last time at a child conference, you know, NGOs were allowed to accredit, you know, 30 or 40 or 50 people to come and be in the building. And this is why at Beijing +5, we had 300 people. But then they clamped down on that. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that a small number of pro-life NGOs were bringing so many people into the building, and they no longer felt safe.
Yeah.
Well, when it was 100 to 1 against, they were okay with 100 to 1 against. If it got 20 to 1, they got nervous.
Yeah. Do you remember the time that
They always outnumbered us.
Do you remember the time that they stole our list?
What list?
Our list of people that were coming. It was like we were at the desk, you know, getting badges for people, and somebody behind the desk took our list and walked away with it.
Wendy Wright couldn't get a pass, and they said, your pass is already gone. And I went to security to complain, and it was one of the jerks who'd arrested me on that second day I was there. And it took about an hour for me to realise that it was him, and he realised it was me. But what had happened, someone at UNICEF had just said, someone came in and weren't on the list. And they just gave one of Wendy's passes to this particular person. And we had found the person who had the pass. We did a little sting and found her. And she didn't realise it was illegal what had happened. So I took her up and Wendy up, and it took me an hour to explain to this security bloke that this woman had been given one of Wendy's passes for concerned women.
You know, I'm looking at the chat room, and somebody from Real Women of Canada, stalwart organization at UN negotiations, is there. Patrice Pedersen, who of course everyone remembers, she writes, I'll never forget John in Lisbon, she thinks, when the chair was trying to close the meeting while ignoring the Holy See's raised placard. He kept saying that we had achieved consensus, and John stood up and said, Mr. Chair, I have not consented. I will not consent. We have not achieved consensus.
The funny thing how this word consensus is so malleable. I think if, a few people agree it's consensus, but it isn't, is it, John?
Well, back at, John will remind us that back at Rio, consensus meant if 3 delegations objected to some language, it was taken out. And that has changed
Yes.
substantially since those days.
And it was my contention, as long as there was one, me, that there was no way that they were going to get it through. At a certain point, I remember we had 14 delegations on our side, and the EU was trying to close debate. And Mexico was the chair, and it was in Beijing. And the chair ruled in favor of the EU. And so, and I said, as a point of order, how is it that 14 is what is it? 15 is the magic number? What is the magic number?
Doug Silva, who you both know, is in the chat. And Doug reminds us that Monsignor Anthony Frontiero was a hero, as was Father Arujo.
Father Arujo was
yes, at Disability Convention.
Yeah.
No, and at the international, the Court of International, ICCU, National, what's it called? The International Criminal Court. He's a human rights lawyer, and he was fabulous. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago.
Well, I just want to make sure everybody understands that there have been people at the Holy See all along who have been fantastic. I mean, to this day, who have been fantastic. But over the years, the Holy See, has not been as aggressive in negotiations as it was under John, Martino, Navarro Valls, JP2. And you guys took a tremendous amount of flack for that. But let's go back very briefly to the International Criminal Court. It's very interesting because it resonates to this day, because not a lot of people know that there are 2 definitions of gender, one non-binding from Beijing, plus from the Beijing Conference, and one binding in international law from the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court. And in Beijing, it's gender is to be understood as it has traditionally been understood, and in the Rome Statutes, it's gender is men and women in the context of society. Now, the other side hates this, and to this day, they're trying to get it changed. There's an effort to reopen the definition of gender in the ICC statutes. But a great victory for the pro-life and pro-family coalition that was there.
But also enforced pregnancy was neutered by the Holy See putting in not to affect national pregnancy laws. And
that's right. And enforced pregnancy, as far as I can tell, and maybe Stefano can jump in here, really has not made a reappearance in negotiations since that time. I think that we have totally taken that away from them. Stefano, can you comment?
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat the question, what is it specifically?
Has enforced pregnancy ever come into, has it come into UN negotiations in recent years?
No, but they are trying to get it into a new treaty on genocide. There's like the ILC, the International Law Commission, has prepared a treaty for states to negotiate, and that they bring back enforced pregnancy again. And they do, that's another one of the definitions they want to change.
Yeah, this new genocide treaty, I don't know if you guys are aware of this effort to have a new treaty on genocide. And in there, they will introduce enforced pregnancy, but also try to change the definition of gender. This is something we've been following now for a couple of years.
Jeanne, could you try and speak now? You should. Can you try speaking, Jeanne?
Jeanne?
Can you hear us?
I thought I heard Jeanne speak.
Yeah, Jeanne, we heard you there for a second. Try speaking. Hello, Jeanne?
You know, the problem with this is Jeanne is going to punish you and me, Peter.
Mainly me, Austin.
I can't believe
nothing new there.
You took Jeanne's link.
Jeanne, could you try and speak
now?
I
couldn't get in any other way. Sorry.
if I can just say something about the gender issue and when that first came up, because
Please.
the person who was amazing about that was, her name is Marta Lorena Alvarado de Casco from
Marta de Casco.
From Honduras.
Salvador. From where?
From Honduras.
From Honduras.
And she, and since she's an H and I was an H, that is Holy See and Honduras, we sat next to each other, which was, and she was amazing because she would take a bottle of holy water that was in the shape of the Blessed Mother, and it was plastic bottle of holy water, and she would sprinkle it around the desk. So we know that we were on safe ground. And the first time that gender came up in the first PrepCom, because people need to understand that there is PrepCom after PrepCom after PrepCom before an actual conference. So just attending a conference, but if you only attend the conference, you're almost dead in the water, right? You have to do all these PrepComs. And so I had the honor to sit next to Marta, and then the night before, the Vatican had asked me to meet with these delegates. And so I met with them, and they said, well, there's 5 sexes. And I said, I've only had one drink. How many have you had, And so they started telling me that, there's.
Hello, everybody.
Oh,
Yay!
hello.
Hi!
Has arisen from the dead.
This has been a struggle.
Hello. Not as
Jeanne,
many
you're
as
a struggler, Jeanne.
the UN.
Jeanne, I regret to inform you that the hour is over, so goodbye. Totally
What?
kidding.
I've got to go. I'll be back in a minute.
What happened to Peter?
I think he had to run to the men's room.
Oh, well, Peter
Well,
looks the
Jeanne-
best of us all.
Jeanne, we have had an hour-long conversation. We're still going. Oh, by the way, I want to say Campaign Life Coalition is in chat saying hello to everybody. It's fantastic to see so many of our old allied organizations in the chat.
I'm sorry I missed it all.
Oh, you know what the problem is, Jeanne?
What?
Peter used your link.
Don't tell her
That's
that.
what happened.
That's what happened.
It's all Peter's fault, huh?
It is all Peter's fault. So Jeanne, let's backtrack a little bit, because we were talking about an hour ago about how people first got involved in this crazy thing at the United Nations, and your story is terrific. So would you tell our audience when you first heard about this and what you did?
When we first heard about it I've forgotten the year now. When was it? The first PrepCom for Cairo.
24.
We got a message from the Holy See that they needed help at this conference. And the Holy Father asked for people to come and help because they were overwhelmed with people on the other side. And there was nobody on our side in the non-governmental organizations. And so, as I remember it, what National Right to Life did is they told us that we have 1-page papers on everything, and we had a press release on it, and we had a 1-page paper on all the issues. And then we met with Archbishop Martino and what was his name? I can't remember, John. And they told us what to do. And so, as I remember, it was Dan Zeidler and myself that were there that first PrepCom. And when I met John, I was passing out some of our papers, and he was at the shelf there where they're picking up papers when I first met John. And I know Dan Zeidler, I was saying, Dan was really very much involved in the beginning, and he would, Bella Abzug had these huge meetings in the conference room of all her minions, and Dan Zeidler tried to get in them, and they threw him out every time. And they really couldn't believe that we were there, I guess. I don't know. They didn't want us there, and they tried to keep us out of everything. And it was just, I don't remember who else was there besides Dan. I don't remember. John, do you remember?
I remember that it just kept growing, the number of delegation, I mean, of, representatives and.
Yeah, but there were just the two of us then, I
Yeah.
think. And
But-
Dan was working on the Latinos. He's in charge of the Latin American. And he was very much involved in all of the conferences. He brought people in. His assistant was there. We broke, I don't know how many copiers at all these conferences.
Oh, do you remember that whole thing about getting the copiers, Peter?
Well, in Istanbul, we actually hired a copier, and we just about melted onto the hotel floor where we ran it.
Wait a second. At the UN, didn't you like sneak into offices and use copiers or?
Well, far be it from me, with my background and heritage, to say that I'd actually stolen anything. I mean, my country.
The statute of limitations has run out, Peter. You can admit it.
We would go down to the library sometimes and use the photocopy there, and you get into the back of the room and you could use that one there. And sometimes you had to provide your own paper, but we could do the English flyer, and Majid Katni would do the Arabic flyer. Dan Zeidler would do the Spanish one, and Louis de Rocco would do the French one. So, we did pretty good with the different languages.
Hey, Jeanne, would you talk about the word reproductive health? I know one of the really interesting things you say is that you never tell your story about what you did before.
Okay, when I went to the UN, before the UN, I had never heard I spent all my life in taking care of women and mother and babies and other patients too, but mostly delivery room and taking care of mothers and babies and taking care of women. And I had never heard the term reproductive health. And I know, as I recall now, we did the research on it, and the reproductive health was designed. The term reproductive health was designed to cover Planned Parenthood's involvement in abortion.
Yeah.
And so the term was designed to cover the abortion issue and to make it abortion legal. That was their euphemism, which they used. And there was anytime we tried to define reproductive health as including with a healthy mother and a healthy baby, they never wanted to use those terms.
Yeah.
Resulting in a healthy mother and a healthy baby. I tried to get those terms into the UN language every conference, and it said reproductive health, which provides for a healthy mother and a healthy baby. And they, of course, would not accept that.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Safe outcome for mother and baby, I think it was.
Yeah.
Which is why it was a little frustrating in recent years when some in our coalition have argued for the acceptance of the phrase reproductive health. Caused a lot of trouble in our coalition. Yes, Peter?
Well, there was a definition that the UN came up with, UNFPA came up with, that was used at the Cairo Conference, saying that reproductive health included regulation of fertility, and under regulation of fertility was interruption of unwanted pregnancy.
Yeah.
So that was what we used to give out copies of that en masse.
Yeah.
So that according to the UN, it included abortion.
I haven't checked in a long time, but that definition of, regulation of fertility includes abortion has been up on the WHO website for years and years. I haven't checked in a long time. So It was really, a funny kind of negotiation that somehow reproductive health would be acceptable. So Jeanne, what did you see over the years with regard to the effectiveness of the pro-life coalition at the United Nations? At Cairo, it was a bunch of amateurs, running around doing amazing work. And there was a development of professionalism and expertise that came over the years. Can you talk about that, Jeanne?
Well, it basically, we began to understand how to lobby. We with our numbers and with the increase in numbers, made a big difference. And what the biggest difference was to the delegates, because the delegates then depended on us to support them. They
Right.
depended on us to help them, and then they would ask. But there were certain things that we couldn't get beyond for. With some of them, because they had other, they could get as far as we could get them to do is to stop using the term reproductive health unless it was qualified. But we couldn't get them to say reproductive health does not include abortion. And we couldn't get them, we just couldn't get them to say it. And I was trying to think of the term that always got to us was, I was trying to think of that last night and I can't think, but the Muslims always wanted that, has to do with their, as Israel actually. And there were certain things that they wouldn't go beyond.
Yeah.
And they agreed with us on reproductive health, but I also used us in that way too, I'm sure. But
you just talked a second ago about Israel. The UN, as we all have come to know, and you knew it almost immediately as soon as you arrived there, is that it was UN negotiations are a little bit of a Rubik's Cube. That often, as Americans or as members of the United Kingdom, that we were often talking to governments that were hostile to our own countries. Talk about that, would you, Peter? What
Iran, the Iranian delegates were pro-life.
some of our best friends were
They were our
Iranians
best
on the abortion
friends.
issue.
And I used to have students that I had from Regent University come up. Would go to the Iranian mission, and the ambassador would come out, and we'd say to the students, "Don't ask this, don't ask that." And this ambassador was really nice, but he had been one of the students in the siege of the American embassy.
Yeah.
Back then, and as
Yeah.
soon as Israel was mentioned, it just would explode with rage. But they were pro-life, and they were against abortion. It was and Sudan was another one. It was incredible. These sort of countries that not only hostile to the United States, hostile to a lot of countries, but they got along with us, and they weren't concerned that we were Christians. Because a lot of people think Muslims and Christians don't get on, but at the UN we did, and I made some incredible friendships with Sudan and Pakistan and lots of those countries, and Indonesia. So it's the one place where the Christians and Muslims got on together.
One of my memories of, maybe it was Cairo +5, we were heading into an all-night negotiation, and I went out on the floor before it started and spoke to the Sudanese ambassador. And I said, it's going to get really rough out here all night long. And you should just understand that right over there in the gallery are 20 Christians praying for you. And that night, the Sudanese ambassador was just a tiger. He was even pounding on his desk to be heard. So we have always thought that we have done a fair amount of apostolic work in working civilly, kindly, on common issues with people who, maybe, hostile to our countries and hostile to our faith.
Yeah, well, our best friends, like two of my best friends were from Egypt, and I can't all of a sudden I had think of the what's her name, the beautiful woman from I can't even think of her name, but anyhow, we made among of our best friends were the Muslim countries, and because they really agreed with us on the abortion issue, but there were certain lines that they wouldn't cross, and that's why we weren't able to get further than we wanted to.
Yeah,
Do
We could not get as
Also,
far as
but
we wanted
also
to.
there was a
hold on, Peter.
there was a mixture of evangelicals, Catholics, and Mormons all worked together at the UN, which I think was remarkable.
John, go ahead.
you remember Benazir Bhutto in her talk at the Cairo Conference? She said, "We must concentrate on that which unites us. We should not examine issues that divide us. This conference must not be viewed by the teeming masses of the world as a universal social charter seeking to impose adultery, abortion, sex education, and other such matters on individuals, societies, and religions which have their own solid ethos." She says, "Governments do not educate our children, parents educate children. More often, mothers educate children. Governments do not teach values to our children. Parents teach values to our children. And governments do not socialize youngsters into responsible citizens. Parents are the primary socializing agents in society. In most society, that job belongs to the mother." And I remember when she made that, I mean, you can imagine she was totally ostracized by Norway and, you know, the rest, but it was a beautiful talk. And of course, she was eventually.
Let's talk for a minute about the Trump administration. One of the things that I say is that the Trump administration was better on the pro-life issue at the UN than the Bush administration, and I just don't think that that's debatable. Can you guys, do you guys agree with that, or do you want to push back on that a little bit?
Well, Bush did everything he could do, but our problem is the, what do they call them? The people who, the delegates who are lifetime delegates. What's the word I want to
permanent
use? The what? The
Career appointments. The career appointments.
People, the underlings would get in our way. We would have to go all the way to the top to get something done, because the US, for example, when the Bush administration first got in, some of our friends on the other side were telling us that the person that was representing the US was working against us.
Yeah.
In other words,
we had to go to the top to get anything to do anything.
Well,
which was a hard job. Now with Trump, he was educated and he did everything he possibly could. When he was, I think he had he became more pro-life than he wasn't before, and he became very pro-life. It's like he was a convert, and he was better than some that weren't.
And I think Pence was
go ahead, John. I'm sorry, John, I spoke over you. Go ahead.
I think Pence was one of the main actors behind. I mean, he was so pro-life and so Christian, and so, you know, he was very clear constantly. And then the president adopted so many of the things that Pence had stood for. And I mean, there certainly was never a more pro-life president than Trump. I mean, I don't know what experience you all had at the UN in the Trump years, because I just don't have that history.
Well, you know, it was very hard, you know, but there were people involved in the Trump administration. I mean, HHS was solid, you know, and so people like Valerie Huber and others at HHS were a valuable contribution to the negotiations. There was a young woman named Bethany Cosma, who was at USAID, who was excoriated globally for the work that she did at the United Nations. You know, there were people on the Domestic Policy Council, Andrew Bremberg and Katie Talento. I mean, Katie Talento would follow G7 negotiations late at night and then text us on some of the things that were going on and what should we do. But there was a tremendous amount of resistance internally. There were people on the U.S. delegation to the United Nations who were against us and who sabotaged things. And it, quite honestly, it took 3 years to get a solid negotiating position at the United Nations. That was all taken away within the first 15 minutes of the Biden administration. But the thing about Trump was that, first of all, he didn't have the Iraq War. The Iraq War really harmed us at the United Nations because people who would have otherwise stood with us wouldn't, because of what was going on in Iraq. And so Trump did not have that situation. And I think that Trump was also a little bit more fearless than Bush was. He didn't really care what people thought about him, and therefore it was pedal to the metal on a whole lot of things. So for me, Trump was much more effective than the Trump administration was much more effective at the UN than the Bush administration.
Yeah.
I'll remind you that it was during the Bush administration that reproductive health came into a hard law treaty for the first time.
Say that again.
It was during the Bush administration that reproductive health went into a hard law treaty for the first time.
But with that, Austin, tragically, the US said that they were not going to ratify this treaty right at the start of negotiations. If they hadn't have said that, we might have had a little bit more of a chance. I mean, 24 countries objected to it.
Yeah.
But because the US shot themselves in the foot straight off by saying they weren't, it should be
it was the people in his appointees that made that the saboteurs. There were too many saboteurs in the Bush administration.
Yeah.
There were.
And quite honestly, we have learned so much during the Trump administration that we are looking forward to the next Republican administration, because I think that we will be ready in a way that we have not been before. So we shall see. We shall see.
Yeah, we'll see. I have to say that Bill Steiger, HHS during the Bush administration, he was absolutely wonderful. HHS carried the ball during the Bush administration. And at the World Health Assembly, I mean, he fought very hard. And later on, he tried to be an ambassador, to get an ambassadorship somewhere. And I said, Bill, you just tell them that they'll get rid of you then if they approved your ambassadorship. He said, I did, and it didn't work. In other words,
well,
they hated him because he was so good.
I'll just point out that Steiger was Bethany Cosma's boss at USAID. So
he was.
Oh yeah. So he continued good work during the Trump administration.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm glad to hear that, because he was wonderful. He was absolutely wonderful. And I felt so bad because he was so damaged by what he did for us.
Yeah.
Do you remember what one of President Bush's main issues that he really cared about was human cloning, and that was something that he just focused on like a laser beam.
Yeah.
And we had the whole, I mean, if he hadn't been there to fight the battle, I don't know.
Yeah, that was a big victory, the cloning victory.
That was a big one. And CFAM gave, we occasionally give out something that we call the Maximilian Kolbe medal. And the very first one went to the president of Costa Rica, Abel Pacheco, for his leadership. I mean, it was amazing. Costa Rica played such a key role in the cloning debate back in those days. Peter.
Who was the delegate, Austin? He became a priest. Remember him?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Oh,
he
was
became
amazing.
a priest. He's a priest in Rome right now.
What's
He
his
left
name?
the Costa Rican delegation and became a priest.
Yeah, what's his name, Jeanne?
All of a sudden, I can't think of it.
No, I
I've
can't
been
think
so
of it either, but he was amazing.
traumatized
He
by
was
trying to
amazing.
get onto this thing. I can't think of anything.
I remember that Mary Robinson had gone to see the president of Costa Rica, and she was trying to convince him not to be in favor of the Holy See in the United States. And so he said, well, I'm sorry, Mary Robinson had been the president of Ireland and then was the head of the Human Rights Commission. And so he said, well, I'm sorry, but I really have to speak to the Holy See about this. And he said, she just got up and left the office. Then he turned to his assistant and he said, do you think it was something I said?
The ever handy Douglas Silva tells us that the name of that priest was Carlos Diaz.
Yes, that's him. Yeah, Carlos.
Carlos, yes, Carlos.
Carlos, yeah.
He's a good
that's him.
friend. I don't know why I couldn't remember his name.
It's because Peter
was a hero.
traumatized you by taking your link.
Carlos,
Jane.
Carlos was wonderful. He was the
Yeah,
most, he
he
was
was.
absolutely wonderful.
We have been blessed. I mean, this is such a funny, I call it a backwater of the pro-life movement. I mean, it's such a specialized thing to be involved in UN negotiations. One of the things that I say to people all the time who complain about the political pro-life movement and all that kind of stuff is that there's something in the pro-life movement for everybody, whatever your taste is, and even, fighting, the local city council or trying to take the lease away from Planned Parenthood or sidewalk counseling or whatever. And there's also this thing that we do, which is so arcane, helping UN diplomats negotiate UN documents. I remember the first time I heard about this, it was after Mass one day at St. Agnes Church. And Father John Perricone had invited a young lady, Kristen McEachern, to town. And Human Life International had raised a bunch of money to open up a pro-life lobbying group at the UN. And she told me this. And I said, holy cow, that's my job. And, like 6 weeks later, it truly was my job. And I've never done anything else. I mean, I couldn't do anything else at this point. If you've read my Wikipedia page.
I think you asked me before what you thought was how we became more sophisticated by knowing how to lobby and to be personal with the delegates. And you had to be there. It made a difference. I remember, would you tell me that, Peter? No, Patrick told me that. The delegate from Pakistan, and he was in the negotiations, and there was a different delegate from the UN, from the US, and something came up and he didn't support it. And we asked him, he was asked, why didn't he, I think by Patrick, why didn't you support? He says, I was afraid to because I didn't know. Jeanne might be mad at me. He didn't know whether
I also had, Jeanne, I had a Pakistan delegate come up to me one time and say, I'm sorry, Peter, we can't support that language. And I said, why didn't you tell Jeanne? And he said, I'm afraid of her. And I must say, what the most common thing the delegates have said over the years, they would say, just seeing you there in the building gives us courage. Even if we didn't do anything, we were just there.
It's bearing witness.
Yeah, that was the biggest factor.
Golly, Peter, sitting on those couches hour after hour. Oh.
One time we were there for an all-night negotiation, and the delegate from the opposition came out and said, well, we had to do something because we knew you were out here and we had to do something to help you.
If you think back, one of the most moving experiences of my life was I got a phone call one day from a woman who was the daughter of an employee of mine when I was head of Catholic Relief Services in Thailand, and he was my medical director. And she said, John, I don't know if you remember me, but I was thinking of having an abortion, and you gave me a job and you convinced me not to have the abortion. And she said, I just want you to know that I was at my daughter's graduation today.
Nice.
And it was just, back to your point, Austin, even if you save, I think that the job that all of these wonderful people did saved millions and millions of lives.
Yeah, I think so.
Even if it were just one, it's all worth it.
This is why I think the general judgment is going to be so interesting, is because it's there that we're going to learn all these things. One of the great stories is from Beijing +5. As you recall, there were thousands of radical feminists there. And remember, we had the red motherhood buttons and drove the other side crazy. And we had the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal there in their full habits. And one of the great stories is in the lobby there were like 1 million radical feminists, and there was one of the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal sitting on a couch talking to one of these radical feminists. And apparently she said to him, I'm very rich, I'm very well known in my country, and I'm very unhappy. Can you tell me why? And he said, because you do not know Jesus Christ. Whereupon she began to howl in pain. Her radical feminist friends came around and wanted to find out what he had said to make this happen. She waved them away and they continued talking, nose to nose. And we will not know the rest of that story until the general judgment. But I bet it's a good ending.
Dan Zeiler called me the other day and he said, do you remember?
Jeanne, we can only see your ear.
Oh, sorry. I'm
That's
trying
better,
to hear.
Jeanne.
That's the best part of me right now. Dan Zeidler called me. I wish he could be part of this because he was so much part of it. But he said, do you remember the button? Sex is
better than gender.
Sex is better than
Sex
gender.
is better than gender.
That was yours,
That
Austin.
drove them crazy. Sex is better than gender when they were fighting the gender issue.
I was just in a really interesting meeting at the Heritage Foundation on gender ideology, and that sex is better than gender came up in the meeting, that somebody was talking about this. And no, Peter, it was not mine. That came from somebody else. That was not me.
CFAM produced it, I'm sure.
Well, I think
He found a button. He found a button among his souvenirs. That's how he had
The family was the other thing.
Yeah.
And then opposition, I think they did one, the family by choice or something.
Yeah.
They did a reaction to it, but I'm sure that came from CFAM.
All right. We might have made them, but I don't think we came up with the line "sex is better than gender." I think that
the gender. I remember at the Beijing PrepCom, John, you had a babysitter who was doing a course in some college, and she had a paper on the 5 genders. Remember,
so that was the story that I was going to regale you with a little bit. Is that there's Marta Lorena de Casco. I was instructed to go and meet them and have cocktails with them to figure out, because they were saying that gender should not be accepted as a term, and we were thinking, really? I mean, you don't want to have non-discrimination, non-sex discrimination. She says, we're happy not to have sex discrimination, but we're not happy to have this gender discrimination issue, because it means all sorts of things. And I said, and she says, well, it means 5 sexes. And so I went home, and my nanny had been working on my computer, and I said, I'm sorry, but can you just clear the decks, because I have to send a fax, because in those days we didn't have anything except fax.
What's a fax?
Yeah. Friday.
one after the carrier pigeon.
And so I looked down and I thought, what is this? And it was called Reimagining Gender, right? I mean, literally, this was in front of me. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess I'm supposed to read this, God, And so it was all about this fellow her professor, who, when asked if he was male or female, he replied yes. And so then it went on from there. And she happened to be a Russian refugee in this country. And for her, this was just like nuts, Yeah. And so I had to write back to the Holy See, to the Secretary of State, and tell them that the gender meant 5 sexes, and the foreign Cardinal Turan from then on, every time he would see me, he'd say, here's the 5 sex guy, right? So anyway, we get to the Beijing Women's Conference, the first meeting, and Honduras is sitting to my right, and it is Marta Lorena, and she raises her hand and she said, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairperson, she was an Austrian, and she said, yes, the distinguished delegate from Honduras is recognized. She says, I would like to bracket the word gender. And she said, you'd like to bracket the word gender in this sentence? No, Madam Chairperson. You would like to bracket the word gender in this paragraph? No, Madam Chairperson. Further, you would like to bracket this word gender in this chapter? No, Madam Chairperson. I would like to bracket the word gender wherever it appears in this document. The entire room it was like putting a stick in a bicycle, you know. I mean, the whole thing just stopped completely. And I thought, I never would have had the courage to do something like that. And Marta was just, you know, and so then the distinguished delegate from Australia said, you know, I'd like to request that she withdraw this ridiculous suggestion. And basically the back and forth went on for 15 minutes. And she said, well, I'll withdraw that as soon as because the Australian said the word gender has been used at the United Nations for quite some time. And she said, well, respectfully, not in this way. And she said, but I would be willing to withdraw it if you would withdraw your brackets on a couple words, which I believe have been in use at the United Nations for a long time also. He says, what is that? And she says, you bracketed the word human being wherever it was.
Yeah.
Because
what was that?
Human being.
Yeah, ever imply that a fetus was a human being. And so, but that started the Battle of Beijing it was the first sentence and the first thing, and it just kept on going from there.
You know, though we have two good definitions of gender in UN documents, non-binding and binding, the gender ideology has been on a full gallop since that time. We just got a document about the UN Disarmament Agency developing their own gender policy. So one of the big disconnects we see at the United Nations is between the General Assembly and the UN agencies, who do exactly what they want, as you all know. But I want to, before we move on, I know Dan Zeidler is present in watching our webinar. Dan, I just unmuted you. If you'd like to say a few words, you are welcome to the floor.
He's still shown as muted here. He's still shown as muted. I can see the mute on.
Well, he's muted himself. I think he's muted himself. Dan, you can unmute and speak.
You hear me?
There he is.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, guys. Hi,
Hello,
Dan.
good people. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. I missed a little bit of it, but it brings back so many memories and important things. And I'd just like to say a couple things. Austin, at one point you asked, what's the difference between the early days and now? I would say one great point is the professionalization of all of you people, CFAM, Sharon, all of you people that have been working on this. It is amazing. I look at it in awe and in thanksgiving to God, how far we've come. I remember with Jeanne way back when in the old days, we really didn't know what was going on. And we looked so much to the Holy See. What should we do? The development, for example, of those flyers, the famous flyers that we've been talking about, I think that came from Monsignor Dermot Martin, if I'm not mistaken. The idea that we have to be concise and just a sheet of paper with not a lot of words and big type to convey to people. And I think that really worked. Now, of course, the whole medium is different, but I give thanks to God for all of you good people. all of your good work, and God bless you. And you mentioned John, Marta de Casco, so many, Elida Solórzano from Nicaragua, so many others from Latin America that contributed in the early days. And that was one of the things that our job was as people on site at the UN, is to communicate with our contacts in country. You mentioned Bolivia, when the Susana, whatever her name, this redhead you were talking about, Christine Volmer, as I recall, from Venezuela, called the Archbishop of one of the Bolivian archbishops whom she knew, talked to it, and within a short period of time, that Susana was quieted. Anyways, there's so many great memories, but I give thanks to God.
We never saw her again.
Yeah.
That was the end of her.
Yeah, there's some of them, we got rid of some of them, but one of them from, I think it was, what country? Well, not American country. He said, "You're not going to get rid of me," he told me.
That was Bolivia. That was Bolivia, Jeanne.
I have also invited Doug Silva to come on and say a few words if you would like to.
Oh,
Hey, Doug,
Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
Doug.
hi, Doug.
where's your video?
I just have to tell you, I don't even think I deserve to speak in the same breath as all of these wonderful people on this webinar. The few years I spent with John and Peter and Jeanne and others like Dan Zeidler and of course Austin stick with me all these years later about just how dedicated and wonderful this team of people happened to be. And I too remember sneaking past Jeanne at midnight or 1 a.m, trying to get home. And I was a relatively young man then, and just astounded at the dedication of this team of people. And I remember vividly an instance where we didn't get the language that we wanted. And I thought it was a relatively small point. And I looked at Jeanne, and Jeanne's eyes welled up with tears at losing a point like that. And I thought to myself, boy, you know, she's the real deal. I'm really not, because I was ready to just move on to the next little conflict, but it was life and death for Jeanne Head. And that goes for all of you on the panel. And I just want to recount a little story with Peter, when Peter escorted me to the House of Lords in Westminster to
I remember it.
to give a little talk on the UN Population Fund. And we just had the most amazing time. And it was such a wonderful opportunity to collaborate with all of you. And Austin mentioned the general judgment. I just cannot imagine how many children will be able to smile at you, all of you, at your general judgment because of the work that you've done over the years. It's really astounding, and I'm just thrilled to have been able to participate in a very minor way in what all of you have accomplished.
Doug?
I have to respond, Austin. I have to respond. Doug Silva said that the House of Commons tea room, we did threadbare better than anybody else. And I thought he was very cheeky when he said that. And then I took him over to the European Parliament, and we had a little tete-a-tete with Mary Benotti, the UNFPA representative for Ireland. And Doug was magnificent, explaining to her how UNICEF was not such a good organization.
Oh, UNICEF. Jeanne, you
And
were gonna
Doug,
say-
I have to recount the story of one of the first meeting that the Bush administration had with NGOs, NGO meeting. And all of those radical women were carrying on like banshees. And Dora Bush was there at the time. And
Oh,
they
yes.
started denigrating, speaking against fatherhood.
Yeah.
And Doug, who was always very quiet and did things very softly and easily, went berserk. He went after them with all guns shooting because he was so furious of how they were saying fatherhood was not important.
Now, Jeanne, I spoke first and then you spoke, and then Doug Silva dealt with the rest of them with his PhD, and it was magnificent. And
Hey,
remember,
Jeanne, what about when you and I got thrown out of the German consulate together?
Oh, yes, I forgot that.
for assaulting the guard, Jeanne, remember that? You were meant to have assaulted the guard. Just
Well,
a tongue lashing, that was all.
You all, we generally schedule these for an hour, but since Peter ruined Jeanne's getting on for such a long time, we've kept it going longer. And I want to close with a little bit of a presentation. And I'm glad that Doug is on the line and Dan Zeidler is on the line too. And this is, CFAM has presented the Maximilian Kolbe Friend of the Nations Medal only 3 times. First to Abel Pacheco, then President of Costa Rica, for his leadership in blocking human cloning. Cardinal Renato Martino for his longtime defense of the unborn child to the UN, and then a few years ago to Christine Vollmer for her life of service to the pro-life and pro-family cause. Jeanne, today arriving by FedEx, and I was kind of hoping it would be here by now, we are on behalf of the staff and the board of directors of CFAM, we are delighted to present you with the Maximilian Kolbe Friend of the Nations Medal. The global right to abortion does not exist, is an accomplishment that can be credited to you and your tireless efforts through long days and long nights at UN headquarters and in negotiations around the world. You are among the great unsung pro-life heroes whose names will forever be stamped in the book of life. So sometime in the next hour, Jeanne, you're going to get a really lovely medal that was designed by Karen Novak and that we've only given out 3 previous times. So thank you, Jeanne, for all that you have done.
Oh, I'm honored and humbled. I don't deserve it, but thank you very much. I want to cry.
That was my goal.
Honor.
You deserve it, Jeanne.
So I think that we will sum up then. John, do you have any final words for our viewers?
I just wanted to say how glad I was to see also Dan and Doug. Dan gave me in Rome one time. He helped me do a Spanish talk that took about to all the South American bishops. Do you remember, Dan? And you prepped me for that in Spanish, which is not my cup of tea. And Doug, the reason that I felt that I could go on and move to California with my family was because I knew I was leaving things in great hands. So, but thank you, all of you, for all of the great work. I mean, I could not have, and the Holy See could not have done anything like we were able to do at the time without all of you being there and giving us support. I mean, it's the witness also of just as one of you was saying earlier, just seeing you there was amazing. And then the effectiveness of it, and then the organization from CFAM of getting everybody together at that point. It was because before you came on board and after you came on board, the difference in the negotiations was just night and day. So God bless you and thank you so much.
Peter, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Austin, for hosting this webinar. It's been brilliant. And thank you for all the time you've let me use the office at CFAM. And I'm just so impressed with how I've been all around the world in different places. And when I mention I've been at the UN, invariably people say, do you know Austin Roos?
Isn't that annoying?
The UN
Isn't
before
that
Austin was
annoying?
there, you know, and all that sort of jazz.
Exactly.
And it's wonderful what you've done with the Friday facts, and the amount of information you've put out is absolutely astronomical. And I'm just so thankful to God that you're there and you've kept going all these years, and you've got other people there who are very, very capable, and you've been a blessing to the whole thing. And you've really pretty much taken it over, pretty much. So, I mean, it's been brilliant. And thank you for all that you've done. God bless you.
Jeanne, would you like to say a few final words before we sign off?
Yes, I do. I would like to say, I'd like to share this honor with all the wonderful people that joined us and came and joined the club, and especially you, Austin, who kept it going, and it kept it going still. I could feel secure when you were there and you had people there helping, because I didn't have to work quite so hard. And and I just was also John Klink is to be commended for the wonderful work he did at the UN. And I think John was really responsible for the Holy Father calling on all us to join. I think John persuaded the Holy Father to do that. I don't know that for sure, but I think so. But I would like to, thank all of you, Dan Zeidler, all the wonderful people who have taken up the cudgels and have worked so hard. And it makes me feel wonderful that somebody else is doing it now. I wish I could do more, but I guess we have our limitations.
Well,
And-
You're still 70, aren't you, Jeanne?
What?
You're still 70, aren't you?
Yeah, still 70, yes.
that's not possible because I'm getting close to 70. I did not intend for this wrap up to be praise of me, but since it did come, I will just say one of the great honors of my life is working with you guys. And CFAM would not be anything without this amazing staff that I have. We would be nothing. Lisa Carenti has now been with us for more than a decade. Stefano Generini, more than a decade. Rebecca Oas, more than a decade. It is remarkable the people that have passed through the doors of CFAM and that have stayed all these years. And they really are the ones that are doing all the heavy lifting and not me. So the praise cannot be mine, it must be theirs. And so I thank all of you for joining us today. Thanks to Doug Silva for jumping on. Thanks for Dan Zeidler for jumping on. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. And pray for us.
Okay, pray for us. We have to pray for the country too.
We do. So long, everybody.
Or the world.
God bless us.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you. Bye.
John.